That's Francis Muhire, economist, and Richard Ssempala, who's also an economist. May I say Happy New Year to you, gentlemen, starting with you, Ssempala.
Well, Happy New Year to you, Liz.
Francis?
Happy New Year too.
We thought you had arrived in 2025.
Yeah, I'm already in 2026.
Okay, all right, so let's get into the gist of it, looking at the government's release of third quarter finances. First of all, in summary, the keynotes in the last two financial year quarters, you get to look at some issues that were priority for government. In the last quarter, the priority was to the summits that we had. They're done and dusted. Supplementary budgets passed here and there. And so from your assessment, when we say economic commitment, what was the initial economic commitment for this current financial year running, and so far are the fundings aligning to that economic commitment? Mr. Ssempala.
Yeah, well, thank you NTV for the opportunity. As you've mentioned, I'm Richard Ssempala. I'm from School of Economics. Yeah, there I teach students economics, and then these things we are going to speak to. Well, we know governments make budgets, and these budgets must align to the objectives or the goals they really put forward to reach. Currently, we are running a National Development Plan 3 and then the Vision 2040. So with the current budget, the aim was more on consolidating the economy, so building recovery from COVID and all of that, and it was really a big priority. We know that COVID-19 came with a lot of shocks that impacted on our economy. Many economies, including outside Uganda, global economies were affected by COVID-19. So the objective mainly was on consolidating the economy to see that we move at the planned rate, about 6% growth rate. So we had fallen back from what we had really planned. So the allocation was mainly to boost the economy and do really work on the issues that had impacted our economy.
Okay, all right, Mr. Muhire, in your own perspective.
Thank you, Priscilla. Good morning, dear viewers. Just as Richard has put it, when it comes to budget allocation or public resource allocation, it has to be in line or resonate with your development policies or strategies. And this case, as I said, we have the National Development Plan now at 3, having more 3, maybe might even have more. And of course, Vision 2040. So the only challenge is that while we have all these policies and strategies in place, the reality is that when it comes to the allocation of budget resources, you know, they are parallel. They are not speaking the same language, and I think that's where we have the main challenge. But when you look at the quarterly releases, for example, when you look at quarter 1, the government through Ministry of Finance released around 4.8 trillion shillings, and then after that in the second quarter it released around 9.1 trillion shillings, and now it has released around 4.8 trillions. But in the middle there, we see a supplementary budget coming in to cover things that actually we've been aware of for over maybe 3 years back. So now that also shows you the problem we have with the planning. Why would you come up with a supplementary budget to cover items or events that you actually knew 3 years before? I mean, you're talking about the recently crossed NAM G77 plus China, but also the supplementary budget came in to cater for things like national identification, you know, national census. You know, these are critical events that at least you're supposed to be aware at least 10 years even before. So we're aware of all these events, and you know, we planned, came up with a budget, and then all of a sudden we are seeing, you know, this supplementary coming in. But it's not new to Uganda. Almost every immediately you finish or they read the budget speech, it doesn't even take 2 months to see this supplementary budget. And the other key item that was covered under supplementary budget was to do with security operations. So when you look at all these kind of items covered under supplementary budget, it clearly tells you that there is a problem with our planning and even implementation. But also when you look at the quarterly releases, as I've said, quarter one we had around 4.9, second quarter around 9 trillion, now we have 4.8. When you try to add that up, remember our budget for this financial was around 52.7 trillion shillings. Mm-hmm. When you bring in the supplementary budget, that takes you to 60 trillion Ugandan shillings. Now, when you see what has been released so far, I mean, we are now in the third quarter, we are just left with one quarter.
One more quarter.
That tells you one of the biggest budgetary challenge we have, which is budget games, where you get resources late. For example, you release these public resources to ministries, departments, and agencies. They end up receiving a lot of money. When it is actually toward the end of the financial year, they cannot absorb these budgetary resources, and they end up, returning back these resources. So at the end of the day, who's going to suffer? Mm-hmm. You're going to have poor service delivery. Mm-hmm. So a common man is going to suffer to them. And what's painful is that we keep on repeating the same mistake year after year. And of course, the question, one might raise the question and ask, maybe the government doesn't have the money. Well, you have to plan according to the resources you think you can be able to get. Not having ambitious plans which we cannot fulfill. And that's why, we have big budgets, but then when it comes to service delivery, there is a challenge. But also, we should also note that in our economy, politics override economics. And if I'm to go deep, I mean, we don't even have enough time. But when I tell you of the budget games, these are not happening by default or by mistake. Some of these things, as I say, the games are always played by certain actors, and they are aware.
When you say politics versus economics, and you presented an argument earlier that for some things that should be planned in advance, for example, the closed summits we had, those should have been planned financially in advance. However, managing or organizing leadership said the reason as to why there was late request for those monies is because they were trying to avoid all these avenues of corruption should the money have come in earlier.
On the contrary to your submission, in fact, it's one of the trick where you want to do things at a late stage. Everything is done by, panicking to the extent that you may not even have enough time to go through the normal way. I mean, through the public scrutiny. We have the structure in place. So when things are done, when you're rushing, you end up not doing things right. We knew that we were going to host NAM. I understand we were supposed to host it, I think, 2020, but COVID came in. And we knew that we are going to host it come 2024. But you saw a week to the events, we are planting trees, we are planting flowers. By the way, I passed by some of those trees and flowers, they're already dry. So that argument does not hold. Mm-hmm. Yes, you need to give yourself enough time to plan and implement under an extended length of time, not just doing things in a short period of time.
Okay,
like we did.
All right, Mr. Ssempala, you have reactions to some of the comments that Mr. Muhire has made.
Yeah, well, Francis has put it rightly that the issue about planning. Well, some of the challenges we really face, and these supplementaries we always see, is originate from non-commitment to planning. A person planning, we plan ahead of time. Mm-hmm. But if you don't plan well, for example, yes, we plan depending on the revenues we expect to get. So in instances where you receive less money compared to what you had planned, then there is a problem. Otherwise, we might need to adopt models. In economics, we do econometrics where we project. So you could really get a projection of how much you will spend vis-a-vis the activities you put forward. Possibly we might not really undertake the right work plans, or if these supplementaries are really coming, so it means that maybe people, as Francis mentioned, might be playing some games, because we expect that people or accounting officers should submit their work plans, and the work plans should reflect the monies they will ask for. So if we get those really changes or differences, we would feel that maybe planning is not done well as expected.
Okay. Mr. Ssempala, something else that was mentioned, and I would refer to the English saying, one man's meat is another man's poison. The let release of funding for different projects and programs towards the end of the financial year, when accounting officers have to quickly do, their due diligence, and what is not utilized returned back to the treasury. And so what is the gain there for government versus the non-gain for the wananchi?
Yeah, well, even the Auditor General put it forward about the unutilized funds. So, and the blame sometimes is put on, the accounting officers, who sometimes send in their requisitions late or work plans late. So, if it's a game, then should be between the accounting officers and in these guys, the ministry, who are responsible for releasing the funds. But it will be really a cost to the wananchi if these monies are taken back, minus fulfilling what they were supposed to really do.
Okay, let's look into the third quarter release from the Ministry of Finance, 4.9 trillion Ugandan shillings. Now, the PSSD says that the areas that are critical to growth for the economy are the ones that are going to be covered. And so priority goes to salary, pensions, gratuity, security, health and education, and critical capital expenditures. Do those align with what you feel should be the commitment to this quarter three funding, Mr. Muhire?
So the packaging of the message is really great, and when you look at the breakdown, it is similar to actually the budget itself. When you look at the funds released, when you broke them down, you realize that actually we're talking more of wage bill, and then gratuity and pensions. And me, as a concerned citizen, may I be waiting for the development. I want to see that allocation being development.
Fronted, yeah.
So that tells you the bigger challenge. For example, when you look at the budget allocation, whether it is this financial or even the previous financial years, you're going to realize that development takes, on average, takes about 11% of the total budget allocation. But guess what non-wage recurrent expenditure takes? You're talking about over 22%. So we are allocating a lot of resources to non-current, non-wage recurrent expenditure, at the expense of what we should be actually paying to development. So now that's where the challenge is, and this tells you the bigger challenge we have, and that the way we allocate our resources is not optimal. We are not rational. So every time you see budget allocation, whether they are quarter releases, the wage, actually, which is not big, but my concern is actually on the non-wage. Non-wage recurrent expenditure talk about expenditure, spending on items like allowances. Travel is a small section. I know that's what they are trying to say, that we, decrease the travel
for former members, former speakers of parliament.
Yeah, talk about the motor vehicles. One area where there is huge wastage of public resources. I mean, you can just do a simple survey, go to any ministry or department and see the cars that are parked and just loading, not being utilized. So we are spending too much on these, non-wage recurrent expenditure, at the expense of development and other critical sectors. Now, when we talk of, this area with huge wastage, we are talking about, allocating resources to critical sectors or items, not just allowances and all these funny things we are spending on. The question is, and this is not an easy one to solve, especially if you join the government today and you're in charge, because you're going to inherit a system that actually is feeding on this kind of fiscal indiscipline. And if you start by, improving or ensuring fiscal discipline, where are you going to start from? I mean, you have to start from the State House, executive, the cabinet. You know how big it is? We're talking about 81 for a country whose GDP is just $50 billion dollars, if that is even the right figure. World Bank has its own figure. You're also talking about the legislature, the member of parliament. So you're talking about an avenue or an item that is highly under or dominated by the political investors or the policy clients, actually, who make decisions. Ministry of Finance, National Planning Authority, and other relevant agencies, they have technocrats, bureaucrats. These are the people who know actually what is supposed to be done. They inform the policy clients, in this case the politicians, but they cannot touch this area because they know that's where the allowances come from, all those unnecessary package come from. Note that it's not good to have these allowances or non-wage kind of expenditure, but we have to remember that at the moment we're a poor country, but with potential to go to a middle income or even developed. The president says that he's now going to transform the economy from $50 billion to 500 in 10 years. So if we are to do that, we have to sacrifice or have deferred gratification.
Well, that would have to come at the magic of a pen, which pen could possibly be oil, maybe, in this case. But Mr. Ssempala, in your analysis with this release for Q3 in the present financial year, are the commitments aligned, truly?
Yeah, well, as Francis has also mentioned, we see that, for me, I take it as we are prioritizing consumption, where we are giving people prioritizing salaries, non-current expenditures, and that's it. But for economies to grow, you need to take deliberate policies aimed at boosting your economy. Invest in those areas that can bring money to pay for the recurrent expenditures. But what I see from really this release is that the government is just committed to clear salaries. Maybe they are trying to avert the domestic debt we have, but it should be a deliberate policy that let us, maybe for these 5 to 10 years, invest in these ventures that will have really much impact, or that will solve the bottlenecks we have as a country, and in that we can get the monies to even pay for these recurrent expenditures.
Okay. You've made mention of invest in areas that can generate money to then cater for the recurring expenditures. In your opinion, which areas would those be?
Yeah, well, we see that I will speak to the cost of production. So if the cost of production is high, and we know key elements that enter into the production function of different farms. For example, if we talk about electricity, if a unit of electricity is that high, so it means that even the producer who's in manufacturing will reduce his profits. We know that most of them really work to maximize profits. So if we solve those challenges related to the cost of doing business in Uganda, then we will really solve these challenges. Take, for example, if you go to Namamve, you see so many people going to work there. So if we encourage manufacturing, for example, more employment will be created for our people, who will, at the end, consume commodities, so we boost aggregate demand, and such production will increase and even the revenues will increase. We've been always crying about the limited budget because our revenue potentials are really small, but if we invest in those sectors, means that we shall create more opportunities for even URA to collect the needed revenues, as well as boosting the household incomes and improving their livelihood.
Okay, speaking of URA, government revenue collection targets between June and December last year were 14.1 trillion, but only 13.3 trillion was collected. And from the PSST's mouth says the shortfall was mainly due to the low customs duty collected because of the less imports and the disruptions in the supply of petroleum products. Mr. Muhire, in your regards, how does this actually affect us?
Well, it does affect all of us. Well, when you look at the revenue performance, URA has tried to do a good job, but you know, it still finds challenge, you know, especially meeting the set targets. When you set a target, you can meet it, or you might overshoot it. Like sometimes actually it happens with URA, but it is not a must that, you know, you have to meet the target. But that is like, you know, it's an indicator telling everyone, especially URA and the relevant government MDAs, that we need to improve our game. So the PSST put it that one of the cause is reduction, you know, in importing, you know, critical products like petroleum. So the question should be why? Why is the reduction in import of, let's say, petroleum products? Could it be because there is low demand domestically? Because if demand is there, then you're going to have these petroleum products coming in. But also, you know, we have challenges between Uganda and Kenya to do with petroleum, you know, trade. So I think which are issues that they're under scrutiny. I understand, you know, the government is trying to look for plan B. They are in talks with Tanzania. So, but when you look at other causes, actually I think reduction in VAT. All these indicators are telling you that there's a problem domestically. You know, we are coming from the pandemic. We are still in the pandemic. We are trying to recover. And the statistics actually indicate that we are doing well. But even before the pandemic in 2019, we are not doing that great. So I don't want to use the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, as an excuse. We need to recognize that globally, the world is going through, for example, IMF called it a financial squeeze. You know, there's a lot happening externally, and which directly affects us as a country. So for the government to think of improving revenue performance, taxation is one of the items. But there are also other important areas which we've neglected. Maybe we haven't reached there in our conversation. But while we think of taxation, taxation shouldn't be the main area the government should be looking at. Yes. Okay.
Looking at the projected planning for the next financial year, there's going to be more taxation imposed. However, the tax base is not going to be widened. And Mr. Ssempala, that definitely is going to be a tough one for economics by and large, especially for the private sector side.
Yeah, well, I think as the government is working to increase more money, to see that we finance the biggest percentage of our budget, and also we avert these challenges that come with limited resources. But it is really a sword we need to really to look at. If you work to increase on your tax revenues, but they shouldn't be at the cost of undermining the sectors that need to create employment opportunities for your people. So it should be a deliberate policy that we should encourage, yes, investors to come, create opportunities for our people that will have really forward and then backward leakages to help in boosting the available resources we can use to finance our budget. So for me, I'm not for that really line of deepening the tax. So we need to expand really the avenues and also encouraging taxpayers to pay the tax. People are willing to pay the tax if they really get commensurate returns to the taxes they pay. I think we saw that during COVID. People were willing to give in money. You give them accountabilities, read their names on TVs, acknowledge them. Yes, they will pay the tax. So, but where the challenge is, if they don't see value in their taxes, then they will shy away. They will get other ways of evading tax.
Okay, speaking of seeing value, is it government seeing value in URA enabling it to collect as much tax as possible from the tax collector amidst these problems? Because if this is not dealt with now, it's going to be recurring into the next financial year. And so what would be the remedies against the low customs duty collections and of course the less imports and disruptions?
Yeah, well, it should be, I think the government need to really government, even URA, need to sit together, see why we collected less. Is it, he has talked about the demand. Is it that people are now reluctant to import these commodities or buy these commodities? Or is a deliberate policy for the government to encourage consumption of homemade commodities, the Bubu initiative? But if we are complaining that we received less from the imports, then there should be a challenge. A challenge because we are promoting Bubu, right? Consume the commodities produced within the country, but also we are complaining about the less imports or revenues from the imports you get.
Okay, all right, so it's very interesting. So we go back to you, Mr. Muhire. You had mentioned or highlighted the fact that as government they should look to alternative sources of revenue. In your perspective, what would you consider the alternatives that Uganda has to be able to collect revenue enough to support our budget as well as our economic development?
Thank you, Priscilla. Before I go to that, I would just like to add something which I think is important we skipped. A few months ago, the government came out and indicated to the whole private sector, especially those who are dealing into petroleum products, that it has given exclusive rights to one firm from UAE that is going to be actually importing the petroleum products. And that is like giving monopoly power to one player. And then when they realized they had made a mistake, the government came out and said, no, even other private sectors can continue importing these critical products. But remember, you're sending a signal to the private sector that anytime I'm taking this whole, I'm monopolizing this sector. So the private sector loses confidence in the government. Maybe they're even indirectly protesting. So that is something we should think about. Now, coming to your question, the government is saying that we are going to have fiscal consolidation. We are going to reduce our budget deficit, but also control borrowing, public borrowing. Why? We have a lot of deficit year after year. The appetite for borrowing as we speak, we are at around 96 trillion Ugandan shillings. And given the budget framework paper, we are going to, actually the debt is going to accumulate over 106 trillion shillings because we are going to borrow again over 13 trillion shillings to fund the budget deficit. And we are talking about deficit, fiscal consolidation. So the government should stop looking at tax as the main source of revenue. The government has for time looked at debt or borrowing and taxes are the main sources of revenue. But I want to tell all the viewers that the government has neglected its opportunities and strength, and this is in terms of the natural resources. When you look at Uganda's natural resource rent, you know, it's just a 7%. The highest we've ever had is 36%, which is, I think, over 20 years ago. So the government has neglected actually its strength and opportunities in terms of natural resources. You know, you talk of tourism. When we talk of funding tourism, developing tourism, not just mere talking about it, but really allocating resources there. When it comes to mining, gold took over from coffee in 2019 as Uganda's leading exporting good. How much are we earning from gold in terms of taxes and royalties? Yeah. So, and other things, we have ivory. If you do your investigative journalism, you realize how much in terms of natural resources that leaves this country does not correspond to actually how much we collect. And this tells you that while the real economy is struggling, but the shadow economy or the black economy is flourishing given the system that actually allows it to happen.
All right, so speaking of systems, finally, Mr. Ssempala, I'll give you the closing voice on this. You have been mentioning policies that can support alternative sources of revenue. And which are those that you would recommend?
Yeah, well, policies that really, if we talk about expenditures, we have seen that often we spend much compared to what we earn or we receive from our revenues. So that should go back to controlling our appetite for spending. I always tell people that we should, if we are poor, we need to live like poor people. So you shouldn't spend more than what you can really get from your revenues. All right,
you should manage your budget. In other words, do not, desire for the grass that is greener on the other side and plan accordingly. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your inputs in regards to, the future of economic development for us as a country. For now, we're going to be taking a break. We're going to be joined later on by Stephen Bide, who will be having a conversation on ground.